Canada's ability to respond to it relies on our ability to work with partners like the Five Eyes community, because not any one of those countries is going to be able to address the issue holistically on their own. We're going to need to coordinate with partners. And that's where China is usually at a disadvantage. It's at a disadvantage when it's not dealing bilaterally.
The United Front's been having a field day in Canada, it seems. Akshay Singh is a research associate at the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's here today to talk about foreign influence, the Canadian bureaucracy, and lots more. Akshay, welcome to China. First off, what is foreign influence?
So I think there's a pretty big distinction between foreign influence and foreign interference, and I'll cover both of those concepts at the moment. So foreign influence, largely in academia and in government communications in the world, constitute open behaviors. So these are behaviors that we would consider to be normal diplomatic behavior, media efforts by a foreign government, either through their state-owned media channels or so on and so forth, essentially overt activities that we know are affiliated with the foreign government. And those are generally okay. Like a diplomat can be able to speak with anybody in our country or in other countries as long as they declare themselves as a diplomat, or they're actually a diplomat. They're not hiding who they are, like they're not an intelligence officer or something pretending to be a diplomat. So that's influence. Like all countries do influence. Canada tries to influence its partners. We use multilateral and plurilateral organizations to go ahead and influence each other's behaviors on things like climate change, human rights. All of those things are totally legitimate. Interference, on the other hand, if we look at it from more of a security lens, these are the types of behaviors that CSIS, our National Civilian Intelligence Service in Canada, defines as behaviors that are clandestine or deceptive or involving some kind of a threat to a person. And I'll go through those concepts just in a second here. So clandestine or deceptive is essentially meaning they're not being overt. So this could be a representative of foreign government conducting activities in our country without being open about it, not saying that they're a diplomat or pretending to be somebody else. It could be using a third party in a country. So for example, they could be contracting out to somebody to conduct activities on behalf of a foreign government without them saying, hey, I'm representing the government of XYZ country. So that's clandestine and or deceptive. So that's using some kind of a covert means to do a certain type of job. And involving a threat to a person is pretty clear. So this means like even if you are a representative of a foreign government, you shouldn't be able to threaten people in a country. So, if you're the representative of the People's Republic of China embassy here, you shouldn't be able to go to a community member and say, if you do this or if you don't do this, then this is going to be the consequence on your family or this is going to be the consequence on you, because that's a threat. And we would call that foreign interference.
On the threat part, do things differ depending on whether the person is in the community as a citizen or not?
So it doesn't necessarily mean that a person has to be a Canadian citizen. I mean, they could be a permanent resident or a student. If they're in Canada, they have certain types of legal protections, right? So if they're harassed, if somebody conducts activities that are illegal, that's targeting them, then they can go to the police and they can seek assistance, right? It's not just because, hey, if you're a citizen, then you're protected. If you're in Canada, you have to abide by Canadian rules. Just like if you're in China, you have to abide by local rules and regulations there, regardless of who you are. It doesn't mean if you're a citizen or not, you get to ignore the rules or that the government's not going to try and protect you.
So we're recording this on March 7th, and a couple days earlier, there were some reports about how Chinese operations in Canada allegedly involved harassing international students. So a really important and interesting thing to bring up is, from the government's perspective, how might they be thinking about regulating this? And are there any playbooks from other countries that Canada is potentially looking into?
Yeah, so, other countries have instituted different kinds of regime to try and regulate activity that would be foreign interference. So in the United States, they have something called basically a foreign registry. It's called FARA. That's the acronym for it. And it was established in the late 30s, actually, to counter Nazi influence or interference in U.S. affairs at that time. Australia set up something similar. It's called the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme or Interference Transparency Scheme, and that's acronym is FITS. It was started in late 2018. Essentially, a registry like that basically says, hey, if you are representing the interests of a foreign principal in a country, let's just say Australia, United States, you have to register with the federal government or some government authority to say, look, my name is so-and-so, I'm representing the interests of XYZ government, and that goes into a registry where somebody knows, okay, well, this person is obviously representing the interests of a foreign government. If you don't do that, then those pieces of legislation or rules impose penalties upon you. So it could be criminal, depending on what kind of penalties are involved. And the U.S. has used FARA to prosecute individuals over several years. And Australia is going through kind of a case study at the moment where they're trying to prosecute somebody who's potentially an interference actor. And that acts as a deterrent to some people, right? They don't want to potentially get caught up in it. It incentivizes people to be a part of the system. So the key here is not saying that, hey, you can't represent a foreign government's interest. Nobody is saying that you as an individual can't do that. They're just saying if you do that, there's an additional step you need to take to be open and transparent about your activities. Because then again, that falls into the influence bucket. We're not talking about interference. So that's some of the steps that have been taken. And as you may have seen in media recently, there have been discussions about that in Canada as well. But that's going to be a long process. Like Australia took a couple of years to institute it. And it's going to have to be tailored, whatever comes up in this country, to the Canadian legal system and to Canada's national interests.
Let's stay on the point about the uniquely Canadian scenario here. What are the upsides and downsides to implementing a similar regime in Canada, and how might that work with Canada's own legal system?
Yeah, so to caveat that I'm not like a constitutional expert or legal expert, I will say that I think there are benefits to having a foreign agent registry in Canada. There are a couple of them. Number one, it enhances transparency when it comes to officials being able to see who they're actually dealing with. So, a lot of times people, either elected or unelected, they interact with stakeholders. They don't necessarily know whose interests these people represent. So having an agent registry might give those officials a tool to be like, okay, well, if I look this person up in the registry, or are they registered with the federal government? Are they representing a foreign interest? And that can dictate the way they interact. So it protects, to some extent, public officials in the country as well. So I think that's a good thing. And then the other thing I would say that it benefits us is that right now, I don't think we have a mechanism that kind of disincentivizes foreign interference in Canada. So, at the moment, you can be an individual who's representing a foreign principal in Canada and engage in activities on behalf of a foreign government, and it's not necessarily illegal, right? It could still be interference, and I think that's a very important point to make. It could fit the CSIS definition of interference, but they don't have law enforcement powers, right? They're an security intelligence service. They inform the government. They don't go out there to arrest people. And the RCMP, without some kind of a legislation to say, hey, you can't do this, they can't prosecute against it. So right now there's a gap, and I think an agent registry in Canada could fill that gap and meet the needs. And one other thing that I think people haven't really been talking about is that while we're talking about federal level politicians and officials, so on and so forth, we also have to understand that interference affects other levels of government. So this is in the provinces, municipalities, so on and so forth. And there have been a couple of case studies where people have alleged concerns about interference at sub-federal levels. For example, in the U.S., there have been some pretty alarming cases in California and other states. So a foreign agent registry doesn't just protect our national level officials and politicians, so on and so forth. It also helps people further down the line if they can access the registry data. So I think those things in totality mean that it's a positive thing to be looking at and to assess. And when I say that we have to tweak it to our legal system, what I mean by that is we have to make sure that we're consulting with people in the country when you create something like this. That includes the diaspora community. It includes people who might be caught up in this, because we don't want to be overboard. Like, you don't want to go too hard where everybody has to register everything. And that's just unrealistic, right? You need to have like a happy medium so that you can tweak those requirements as time goes on. And that requires consultation.
So I want to come back to the point about local governments. In your experience, do you feel that these local governments at the provincial and city levels have the literacy to approach something like this? And is there awareness that something like this not only targets at the federal level, but also at the local level as well?
I think there's a growing awareness at sub-federal levels of the issue of foreign interference, but these groups and jurisdictions aren't exactly resourced to tackle these challenges, right? And we have to understand that in Canada, provinces, territories, municipalities, their main goal is to enable the prosperity of their jurisdiction. They don't necessarily have their own security intelligence services. They don't have their own police forces, depending on where you are. Obviously, Ontario, for example, has a provincial police force, so they can do some things. But not everyone's on an equal playing field. So resources are different, and that means literacy on the issue is different, because people interact with it in a different way than other people across people who do have resources. So, I mean, at the local level, there have been some conversations, for example, in the greater Metro Vancouver region. You may recall, like a couple of years ago, there was a Union of British Columbia Municipalities meeting where there was a concern that there might be donations from the Chinese consulate that were enabling that discussion. And there was a conversation about, do we want that to be the case? And there was some pretty strong opposition to having a foreign government contribute financially to a conference like that, which is for municipalities in the province. And a couple of the mayors were quite outspoken about the fact that the Chinese government shouldn't be involved, and eventually it did lead to, in my understanding, is a separation. But that's kind of an example of like how people are starting to think about it a bit more. Is it sophisticated yet? No, I don't think so. And I think it requires support across multiple levels of government. And it'll require interest from the local stakeholders as well. Like sometimes they might just not care because it doesn't impact them that much. That's fine. But there are other jurisdictions where it might impact them some. And that requires a conversation with people like in CSIS and RCMP to raise awareness in those jurisdictions.
So I just want to ground that in a scenario in case it helps our listeners. Say I'm a member of the Chinese diaspora in, Toronto, and I get offered an opportunity that under most definitions would fall into foreign interference. What could the Canadian government do to disincentivize me from taking that on?
Well, I think we've got to flip this question on the head, right? Because like I said, it's not necessarily illegal for you to go ahead and engage on behalf of a foreign government in Canada. Every person will have a different calculus as to why they would want to do so. Maybe it's super innocuous. Maybe they're representing a foreign government's, a publication interest, right? And they're declaring it openly, right? They're saying, hey, I've been funded by the U.S. government to publish this article or this ad to say that we should invest in the U.S. or whatever, right? So it really depends on the case. The Canadian government doesn't disincentivize people from doing these kinds of things. That's not the role of government. Where the Canadian government and I think other governments in other countries get involved is when there's a threat to national security or to a person's security, depending on what the situation is. So if we look at your question again and we say, look, at what stage could the Canadian government or any government be involved? I think it's at that point when there's a determination that there is a threat to national security, or if that person feels unsafe or they're feeling threatened and they choose to report it. I think the challenge is a lot of people in diaspora groups don't understand necessarily who they can go to. And this has been raised multiple times by various members of the community saying that, because the rules are so nebulous in this country about interference, when they do go to police forces or they go to enforcement authorities at even local levels or provincial levels, there's no easy answer to say, this is what you need to do to try and extricate yourself from the situation. So I think that's another challenge that's been publicly raised several times by people who are impacted by foreign interference. And it's something that we have to look at, because there needs to be a person that they can call to say, I'm concerned about what exactly is going on, and I'd like to report it. And then somebody needs to take that and do something with that. I know that's not the exact answer to your question, but I just wanted to characterize that in a more appropriate way, because the Canadian government's not running around saying, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. That's not the goal of any government, unless it's like something illegal happening, right? And then obviously there's an investigation, so on and so forth.
All right, so now let's bring in China. What is the CCP or United Front's approach to Canada particularly, and what's the end game here?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So the United Front Work Department, which, for people who are listening who don't know what it is, it's essentially a department under the Communist Party of China's supervision. So it's not a government department, which I think people get confused about, given the way the Chinese system is structured. It's a party department. It's a party organ. And it serves the interests of the Communist Party of China. And its main goal is to essentially promote the Communist Party of China's interests abroad or even at home through what they call United Front work. And this involves things like developing close relationships with elites, academics, overseas Chinese communities to help push a common message about about China being an up-and-coming country, about their peaceful rise, so on and so forth, things that align with Communist Party of China interests. And it's a tricky, issue to tackle, because some of these activities are overt, right? The United Front Work Department will engage with community groups openly and say, hey, we're the United Front Work Department and we want to help overseas Chinese groups prosper. I think where that line gets crossed and has been examined by a few people, for example, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Australia, is they're saying that the United Front Work Department also engages in clandestine activities, using or trying to use or manipulate overseas Chinese groups or their contacts abroad to influence clandestinely people's opinions about China, or preventing them from talking about things that the government of China or the Communist Party of China views as being scandalous or potentially problematic. So to give you an example of this, United Front Work Department might not want specific people to talk about what's going on in Xinjiang, right? Or they may not want people to talk about what's going on in Hong Kong, or even local level protests, right? They just don't want those things to be highlighted internationally. And that's when they would obviously engage with their quote unquote contacts abroad to try and say, well, we need to reframe the narrative. We need to ensure that people abroad are getting the correct image about what's going on in China, because they feel like there's essentially a conspiracy against the Communist Party of China and an effort by the West to put China down. So they view their role as kind of promoting those interests. Now, you asked a question about how does that impact Canada? And I think Canada is a piece of that puzzle because we are a close partner of the United States. We're a member of the Five Eyes intelligence collection community. We're a part of G7. We're part of G20. We have a strong economy. We have more influence internationally than I think people give Canada credit for. And it's important for China and the United Front Work Department to make sure that Canadian officials, the Canadian public, and certainly the overseas Chinese community in Canada do not contravene the Communist Party of China's public lines or interests, right? So this is why there have been accusations that certain groups in Canada are influenced by United Front Work Department to put out things in media to say, look, what you're hearing about Xinjiang is wrong, or even trying to highlight China's anti-corruption activities and their efforts to expatriate individuals illegally from places like the US or Canada in a positive light. So there is a concern there that the United Front Work Department is doing the same thing in Canada. And honestly, it impacts the Chinese community most significantly because a huge part of the United Front Work Department now is the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, which used to be a separate entity, but now has been subsumed under the United Front Work Department. I think it just shows how the party views overseas Chinese people.
All right, so say you were sitting at the Canada desk in the United Front Work Department. How would you assess your performance so far?
Well, the key to any Leninist system is to not admit defeat, right? So I'm sure they're probably patting themselves on the back regardless of whether or not they're actually achieving outcomes. But, I think, if I was sitting in the United Front Work Department headquarters and looking at our efforts abroad, I think I would be pragmatic in realizing that there are wins and losses. And one thing we need to consider is that the things that we hear about in media are only the things that are actually revealed. We don't know what's going on in the shadows in the background, right? Those are the kinds of things that the intelligence organizations in places like Canada, US, Australia are investigating. So, if we only take the open source, data, we're only seeing one piece of it, right? So if I'm conducting influence operations or interference operations abroad clandestinely and I'm seeing results and I'm seeing countries not criticize China publicly or being concerned about criticizing China publicly or pushing back against the US openly, then I'm thinking my job is done, at least to a certain extent. And we have seen, for example, countries in Europe, stand up and say that, we shouldn't demonize China. We shouldn't, always just try and paint them in a negative light. And I think in those situations, that's a win, right? That doesn't mean that a whole bunch of United Front work has been done. That could also be the result of normal diplomatic behavior. But as a United Front work official, that's a great positive step. One thing I do want to add very quickly is that while the focus has been on the United Front Work Department, every government department in China and party member has to conduct United Front work, which includes furthering the party's interests. So this includes the Chinese government's police service, the Ministry of Public Security, their intelligence agency, Ministry of State Security, and the People's Liberation Army, right? So it's not just the United Front Work Department conducting these threat activities, it's other departments as well. And that means there are a lot of resources behind it in a way that I don't think the West has really conceptualized or seen since the Soviet Union fell. And I would even argue that the Soviet Union wasn't this well structured when it comes to this issue. They didn't have the kinds of technology that China has today.
I'd love to stay on this because we've actually, on the podcast, covered some of these Sovietology parallels. So what do you think the scale of the operation is? And are there any other states around the world that are also putting this many resources into influencing political systems abroad?
Yeah, we have to be careful because China is remarkably opaque about the actual dollars it puts into these kinds of efforts. So a lot of this is educated guessing. So I just want to add that caveat, right? But if you look at the structure of the Chinese party state, I think you will see a significant investment in security that probably as a percentage overshadows its contemporary partners. The United States obviously invests heavily in security, but a lot of that's defense. We're talking about military spending. It's not necessarily investing in things like a United Front Work Department. The Democrat Party or the Republican Party doesn't have a wing that actually goes abroad and conducts influence activities in the way the United Front Work Department conducts activities, right? Does that mean the U.S. doesn't conduct influence operations? I'm not saying that whatsoever. I'm just saying the scale and the type of activities are different. I think China, you can't really compare them to other state actors at this stage because their system is somewhat unique, right? Even if you look at Russia, Russia today obviously has a pretty, I would say in comparison to other partners, a relatively robust, security mechanism. It's got a semi-functional military at this point, given what's going on in Ukraine. It's got its security services that it has used, as you've seen through case studies abroad, to do things like actually kill people on foreign soil. So it has a functional service. But the scale at which China is trying to do things like interfere with the internet, Facebook, Google, YouTube have all put out statements saying that they've done investigations into what they call inauthentic activity that's been targeted most likely by countries like China. And it's at a scale that they probably have not seen, even from the Russians, right? So I think we got to keep that in mind, which is step number one. It's hard to quantify given that China's pretty opaque. Step number two, the things that we're seeing from the open source indicates that the resources are significant. And step number three, I don't think it's a fair thing to compare them to other countries because it's like apples and oranges at this point, given the way they're structured.
So it seems like in Canada, most of the reports around this came out over the past 3 or 4 years. How do you feel about the ROI from Beijing's point of view? And how has this sort of thing been planned over the long term?
Yeah, I think the timeline that most experts would draw is, after Xi Jinping comes in 2012, 2013, that's when they start seeing a hardening of the Chinese security mechanism and an enhancement of United Front work. And I would agree with that, generally speaking. But I think it's also important to remember that United Front work is not new. It has existed for quite some time. The United Front Work Department has existed for quite some time. We're just talking about a realignment of priorities and the use of the department in a way that we probably haven't understood before. So China has been conducting threat activities, espionage activities for a very long time. And if you go back and look at documents from the 1990s, there will be concerns about China's military activities, intelligence activities. I think what we're seeing now, though, is the reason why we're so focused on it is because China has ascended to a point where perhaps it's performing on par with many Western countries, if not exceeding their capabilities, and obviously creating some significant concern among security partners about what's possible, right? I think the other thing that probably China does better than anybody else is information management control, right? So you've got an entire country that, even though you can escape the quote-unquote Great Firewall with VPNs, so on and so forth, there are lots of people who don't bother. They just exist in the information ecosystem. So they're constantly being influenced by the government in a way that shapes their interests and their thoughts and thinking. And a lot of overseas Chinese members who use tools like Weixin, like WeChat, or Douyin, like, their version of, TikTok, don't realize how that ecosystem is conditioning them to think a certain way. I can't think of another country that does it to that scale. And that kind of firepower to be able to influence an online space, if it's exported to places like Twitter or other social media platforms, could raise significant concerns. And this is what I was referring to earlier, right? When there was the conversation about Xinjiang and what's going on there were concerns that the conversations on Twitter were being influenced by the Chinese government because of this. And they have experience doing this for a very long time. It's just that now they were exporting it to more Western social media platforms. So it's a super complex issue. I know I didn't answer your question directly, but I just wanted to highlight for you the scope of what I think we should be thinking about.
Just contextualize this for the audience, please. To what extent do you think Canada, as a country with a large Asian diaspora, is comparable to any other similarly open Western countries? And do you think the framing of as this being a diaspora problem is useful?
Yeah, I think so. There are two questions there, which is, how does Canada compare in terms of the percentage of diaspora population to other Western countries? And should we be concerned about the way that the conversation has been phrased as being diaspora-led? The first question, so I would say that, as a percentage of population, Canada is one of the higher percentages in terms of the diaspora groups from the broader Chinese diaspora. And that's also a contentious term because some people don't consider themselves to be from the Chinese diaspora, right? For example, if you're Singaporean Chinese, do you consider yourself as being part of the Chinese diaspora? If you're Malaysian Chinese, what do you view your diaspora as, right? And people from Taiwan, are they part of the Chinese diaspora? Those are all questions that need to be asked. But broadly speaking, as a percentage, people who identify themselves as originating at some point from China is relatively significant. And it's concentrated more strongly in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, like the metropolitan centers of Canada. And what that means is that those areas might draw some more attention from the Chinese government in terms of what is the diaspora doing in that space? Are we sure that the Chinese diaspora isn't doing things that contravenes the government of China's interests. And that takes some effort. And that's why there is an overseas Chinese affairs office, right? It's because they have invested resources in trying to build those relationships with the diaspora. Not all of it is nefarious, right? Some of it's cultural activities. Some of it is promoting things like Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year, and bringing more understanding of Chinese culture into other countries, which is a perfectly legitimate and I would say commendable thing to do. But the issue is, do these groups feel comfortable doing things that potentially contravenes the Chinese government's interests? So like if you're a community leader of a diaspora group in Canada, would you feel comfortable standing up in front of a group and saying, I don't agree with what President Xi Jinping is doing in China? And for a lot of people, the answer is no. They don't want to put themselves out there because they're worried about the impact on them and their family. And I think that just illustrates the level of influence that the government of China has built in these groups, are a concern, because these people don't necessarily feel safe to be able, in their home country, express their opinions. In comparison to other countries, I would say Australia, the United States, also have large diasporas that also suffer similar challenges given where they are and how they're placed. But that doesn't mean that, if you're a small diaspora in a different place, that you wouldn't face similar challenges, right? So I think Canada is a relatively big target for the government of China, given the percentage, but it's not the only target out there. And Canada's ability to respond to it relies on our ability to work with partners like the Five Eyes community, because not any one of those countries is going to be able to address the issue holistically on their own. We're going to need to coordinate with partners. And that's where China is usually at a disadvantage. It's at a disadvantage when it's not dealing bilaterally. That's why they oppose things like Quad or the Indo-Pacific grouping, because they feel like people are ganging up on them, which creates kind of an asymmetry in the way they can respond.
Is there an alternative world where some of these activities are not unilateral? If that's like the United Front working with Russia or Iran or, I don't know, something else.
It's always possible for countries to cooperate on interference and espionage efforts abroad. I think the one thing we have to keep in mind is that countries only do this when their interests are aligned. And while people obviously have commented publicly about China and Russia's growing partnership, it's important to recognize that they aren't like best friends. Like they still have a historic distrust for one another. And this comes through the Sino-Soviet split. It also comes through just realpolitik, right? China has gone much further than what I would argue the Russians have been able to achieve. And that creates a level of, I think, frustration in Russia. So I think that the key thing to understand is, sure, when there are shared interests, there could be cooperation, but that we shouldn't be automatically assuming that countries like Iran, Russia, and China are all collaborating in terms of being able to conduct offensive, interference and espionage operations. Is it possible? Yes, but I think you have to think about in what scenarios would that be possible, because they don't all share all their interests. The only thing they do share, I would argue, without argument, is a distrust of the United States and the Western world. They do share that, but the ways they respond to those issues are different, right? China's not exactly quite happy that Russia invaded Ukraine, because that's a blatant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. And one of the main lines that China has put out there is, we don't violate the sovereignty of other countries, which is kind of murky because they have done so in the past as well, like North Korea or Korea, for example. So I don't think you should assume cooperation, but it is possible.
So given Canada's current scenario and the most recent reporting around intelligence leaks, what are some options lying at the government's desk at the moment?
So I've seen in the media that there have been a couple of things that the government's considering, for example, a foreign agent registry, and they're looking at investigating the issue more closely. I think where we're at right now is the media leaks, or the leaks from some source that has classified information, have made people think about this issue more holistically. As I alluded to earlier, the issue of influence or interference is not a brand new one. Countries have been trying to interfere in each other's business since time immemorial. But I think in Canada, what we've perhaps been a bit naive to in the public conversation is how and when and why. And I think those are the questions that are being answered right now. And depending on how we have that conversation publicly, I think we're going to have different approaches to handling the issue. So we're at kind of a turning point, in my opinion, on the matter of foreign interference in Canada. And Australia went through something very similar. There was a very high interest in foreign interference after there were a couple of very public cases. There was a case of a gentleman by the name of Sam Dastyari, who allegedly took some funds and made some very questionable comments that contravened government policy and supported Chinese government policy instead. And then there was a conversation at that point saying, okay, well, what's going on here? Do we need rules to put in place some kind of a registry? And they didn't have one at that time. How do we coordinate behavior? So, and now Australia has laid the foundational stones. They have a registry. They call it FITS, as I mentioned. They've got a person that coordinates counter interference in the government. And maybe those are steps that we're going to be taking as well, looking at Australian case studies. I know there have been comments publicly saying we should just copy and paste what Australia did in Canada. And there's some merit to that. But it doesn't mean necessarily that's what we should do, because we still have different legal systems. I mean, we're very comparable, but we don't have the same legal history. And there are unique things about Canada. You know, Canada's reliance on China is a lot less than Australia. And there are different considerations, for example, for our relationship with the US than Australia has. So we might take more steps, we might take fewer steps, but we're at a turning point, in my opinion, where we're going to start talking about this issue more significantly.
Let's tease out that U.S. government point in particular. How can Canada's relationship with the U.S. factor into the actions it might take?
Well, I think part of it should involve a conversation with the Americans to see like what has worked for FARA and other tools that they're using, right? I think any policymaker in any country, be it Canada, Australia, and the US, wherever it is, they benefit from learning from the mistakes or the positive points of what other countries have done. So the United States, arguably, in the Five Eyes community, has taken the most aggressive stance vis-a-vis China's threat activities or perceived threat activities in the United States. And there are lessons to be learned there, right? There are positives that have come out of that, and there are negatives. There have been people who have been accused of things that probably haven't done anything wrong, right? And we don't want that to happen in a country like Canada. We don't want there to be like a witch hunt of people. We want there to be some kind of a rational approach to this issue. So I think having that conversation with our partners in the U.S. to understand how we can approach this issue holistically is a positive one, but we should also talk to other partners like Australia, like the UK, that is considering their own system for countering foreign interference. And collectively, we can probably come to some kind of an understanding of how to address the problem. I think also we should consider that threat activities like foreign interference rarely respect boundaries, like international borders. There may be people who travel back and forth between countries, right? That are conducting similar kinds of threat activities. And some of those threat actors might be a Canadian citizen or a U.S. citizen. And sometimes we need to cooperate in those kinds of things from an investigative standpoint to see if we can jointly counter that threat. So I think that offers up opportunities as well. Like, if we have opportunities to collaborate on intelligence collection, partnership, and to be able to actually collectively address the foreign interference issue, to me, that's a positive. Again, respecting the rules and making sure we're not going above and beyond or contravening any kind of people's rights.
All right, so one last question. When Canada eventually takes action on this issue publicly, how is this going to factor into the Canada-China relationship post Two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou?
Yeah, I think Beijing is going to push back on anything that it perceives to be a foreign agent registry because it views it as being anti-Chinese behavior, right? Which I think is kind of ironic because in China, if you want to conduct activities in China, the legislative and bureaucratic process there is much more onerous, right? If you're a foreign government and you want to go talk to certain entities in in China, you may not be allowed to unless you seek proper approvals. So, China is really good at this. They use open systems to their advantage because they know they can, and they push boundaries, the legal boundaries they can. And when they get pushback, they'll try to adjust their behavior. But if they don't get pushback, then they view that as permissible, right? So if you do break a law and nobody prosecutes you, have you really broken a law? That's kind of the logic that's employed sometimes by the Chinese government, right? There needs to be consequences. So I think they will push back because this creates, if we do engage in a foreign agent registry or we do have a conversation about it, it will create a disincentive for people to work on behalf of any foreign government, not just China. And it's going to create challenges for them. It's going to close up their ability to do some of the things that they might be doing right now. So I don't think they're going to view it positively. I think they're going to view it as a barrier in the Canada-China relationship. But I don't think at the end of the day, it's going to substantively change the way Canada and China engage. Because if you look at what's going on with Australia right now, they still trade. Both countries still talk to each other. Yeah, China was pretty upset that Australia engaged in this process and established a foreign agent registry, but things change over time. And I think the most important thing to realize is at the end of the day, the party wants to make it seem like they have protected Chinese citizens' interests. So sometimes we're not the audience. They just want to be able to show that they're strong and they're pushing back against what they view as anti-Chinese behavior. So people in China think that the parties behavior is legitimate, and there's no question about the legitimacy of what the Politburo is doing or any kind of threats to the stability of the party. So they might make blusters, they might make sounds, but that might not be geared towards us. They might be geared to a totally different audience, which is a domestic Chinese audience and people in the diaspora, because they're showing they can be strong.
So is there any sort of pushback that you'd expect for domestic audiences in China that could potentially destabilize the bilateral relationship?
In my opinion, that's probably what it's going to be. If the Australian case study is anything to learn from, that doesn't mean they couldn't take additional steps to try and punish, the West or Canada. But in my opinion, they'd be shooting themselves in the foot if they did so, because whether they like it or not, they still need Canada. From a trade perspective, they need Canada from a support perspective internationally. If they're going to meet their international cooperation goals, which is to build influence in the multilateral system and use that to their advantage, they're going to need to bring countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand on board because they're close U.S. allies. And at the end of the day, the more people that support what China is doing internationally, the better it is for them. So they have to balance out to some extent what they want to do.
Thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.